In the late 1960s, as tensions continued to mount between the Israelis and the Arabs, all that was needed was a small spark to fuel a large-scale conflict. The spark was provided by deliberate and false intelligence information from the Soviet Union. But before the recipients could react, the first shot was fired by the other side in June of 1967. The outcome was the Six-Day War of 1967, fought between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a closer look at the Six-Day War of 1967 that changed the political map of the Middle East and the diplomatic equation between Israel and its neighbors. If we were to look at the map of Israel in early 1967, on the southwest we would see Israel bordering Egypt, notably the Sinai Peninsula, which extends Egypt's area into Asia. On its east, we would see Jordan with the West Bank area and East Jerusalem almost stretching into Israel. On the northeast, we would see Syria, notably the Golan Heights, and the west coast is essentially bordering the Mediterranean Sea with the thin Gaza Strip under Egyptian occupation. And on its southern tip, almost wedged between the Straits of Jordan and the Sinai Peninsula, we would see the Strait of Tiran, which was Israel's route into the Red Sea. Now, after the First Arab-Israeli War of 1948 and the Suez Crisis of 1956, the era of the late 1950s and early 1960s was an era of relative calm within the Middle East. But the tensions were still high as the Arab leaders were still aggrieved by their military losses and hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees created by Israel's victory in the 1948 war. Israel was well aware of these tensions, and it believed that it faced an existential threat from Egypt and other Arab nations. Now, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser was trying to project himself as the overall leader of the Arab world. He had concentrated on building a pan-Arabic nationalist movement, and his supporters fully expected that he would recreate Arab greatness and exact revenge on Israel. And in line with that expectation, Nasser had made his closest ally, Field Marshal Abdul Hakim Amer, the commander-in-chief of the Egyptian armed forces. But by 1967, Egypt itself was bogged down in a war in Yemen, which had become its own Vietnam. And Nasser had been unable to find a replacement for Field Marshal Amer. But despite Nasser's ambitions and his preparations, the border between Egypt and Israel had been relatively quiet. The biggest flashpoint was Israel's northern border with Syria. After 1948, the Syrians had sheltered Palestinian guerrillas who were mounting raids into Israel from the Golan Heights area. However, the bigger issue was Syria's attempt to divert River Jordan away from Israel's national water grid. Israel's other neighbor, the state of Jordan, was in an interesting position. A reluctant participant in the 1948 war against Israel, Jordan had benefited the most out of that conflict since it had gained a major chunk of the territory that was the erstwhile Palestine before the 1948 war. Jordan's ruler, King Hussein, was a close ally of Britain and the US and was relatively neutral towards Israel. Hussein's grandfather, King Abdullah, had opposed the proposal in 1948 to enter into a conflict with Israel. But in 1951, a Palestinian national had assassinated King Abdullah at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. A year later, Prince Hussein, who was only 16 years of age, became king, and he continued to hold secret talks with the Israelis. But he was aware of the trouble at home because Jordan housed a restive population of Palestinian refugees. So he was worried about being overthrown if he did not follow the tune set by the other Arab neighbors of Israel. Now, as I mentioned before, the border between Israel and Syria was the most explosive. Syria was actively encouraging Palestinian infiltration into Israeli territory, and all this came to a head on April 7, 1967, with a full-scale air and artillery battle between Israel and Syria, where Israel decisively routed the Syrians. The Arab world was aghast, and pressure started mounting on Egypt's Nasser to act against Israel. And right around this time, on May 13, 1967, Moscow delivered a warning to Cairo that Israel was massing troops on the border with Syria and would attack within a week. And as I mentioned before, this was completely false information. So why did the Soviet Union provide false information about Israel? There are several theories that have been put forth, and some of them include stuff like the Soviets wanted Egypt to pull out of Yemen because Egypt's engagement in Yemen had been annoying to the Soviets. And there's also the theory that since Israel was making rapid strides towards becoming nuclear, Soviet Union hoped that this war could slow its progress. Whatever the reasons, the misinformation had the impact. And on May 15th, the Egyptian President Nasser ordered his army to march into the Sinai Peninsula and demanded that the United Nations pull its peacekeepers from the peninsula. And as mentioned in episode 6, the UN peacekeepers had been put in place after the Suez Crisis of 1956. And following this, on May 22nd, President Nasser banned Israeli shipping from the Strait of Tiran, essentially reimposing the blockade that had been lifted in 1956. And at an airbase in the Sinai Desert, Nasser announced that if Israel wishes to threaten war, we will tell her, you're welcome. Now, with the blockade of the Strait of Tiran, Israel went into full mobilization, which means in 48 hours, about 250,000 army personnel would be put into the field. Nasser's confidence was reaching sky high, and this forced King Hussein of Jordan into a corner. He did not want to back Egypt, but then he was worried about his Palestinian subjects rising against him. So he decided to sign the deal with President Nasser and join the war if it broke out. And as expected, when King Hussein returned to Jordan after signing the deal with President Nasser, he got a rousing welcome from his subjects. With all the aggression and the deals being signed around them, the mood in Israel became very somber, and Prime Minister Levi Eshkol made matters worse by making a disastrous broadcast to the nation on the 28th of May. He virtually stammered his way through the broadcast. So subsequently, Eshkol, who was also Minister of Defense, was forced to give up that portfolio in favor of Israel's war hero, the one-eyed general Moshe Dayan. Now, using the 1956 Suez Crisis outcome, Nasser somehow was confident that the US would not let Israel fire the first shot. And it was exactly for that reason that Meir Amit, the head of Mossad, Israel's spy agency, flew to Washington, D.C. on a false passport to get approval from the US officials to fire the first shot. He met with the US Defense Secretary, Robert McNamara, and got the approval to proceed with his recommendation for war. So on June 5, 1967, the Israel Defense Forces initiated Operation Focus, which was a coordinated aerial attack on Egypt. Now, when it comes to air forces, most of the time a good chunk of planes are down for maintenance. But on June 5, 1967, about 90% of Israel's planes were operational and only 12 fighters were held back for air defense. All of the rest, including jet trainers retrofitted for combat, were thrown into the initial attacks against the Egyptian Air Force. These planes flew low through previously discovered gaps in the Egyptian radar net and approached from unexpected directions, mostly from the west, that is from the Mediterranean, creating a big tactical surprise for the Egyptian Air Force. Also, the attack did not come at dawn when the Egyptians were known to be on alert, but at 7:45 a.m. when most senior Egyptian military and political leaders would be caught in the usual massive Cairo traffic jams. To ensure a continuous wave of attacks, the Israelis attacked in small groups of just 4 planes. While the first group was on target, another group of 4 was on the way and another 4 were just taking off. So as the first wave finished its attack, the second wave was about to attack and the third wave was on its way. And when the third wave was finished, the first was back to attack again, having rearmed and refueled in just minutes. This continued for more than 2.5 hours, giving the Egyptians no time for recovery. When the attack started, Egyptian Field Marshal Emmer and the Egyptian top brass were meeting at an air base in Sinai. Emmer's plane was able to take off fairly quickly, but had nowhere to land as every Egyptian air base was under attack. By the time this wave completed, about 18 different airfields had been attacked, and roughly 90% of the Egyptian Air Force had been eliminated before it had even taken off. The Israelis had done their homework. They had flown hundreds of reconnaissance missions over the years to build up an accurate picture of every air base in Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. From layouts, call signs, and defenses, they even had voice recognition files of the main Arab commanders. So with the Egyptian Air Force mostly destroyed, the Israeli Air Force was now able to focus its attention on the Syrian and Jordanian fronts. Meanwhile, on the ground, Israeli ground forces had pushed into the Sinai Desert, confident that the Egyptian forces would not get any air cover, and continued to move forward rapidly in 3 broad thrusts. Once again, the Israelis had done their homework and scouted the Sinai Peninsula fairly well to provide an element of surprise to the Egyptians, who felt that a lot of the dunes in that area were impenetrable. Realizing that he was in a defenseless position in absence of air cover, Field Marshal Emmer ordered a general retreat from the Sinai Peninsula. By day 3 of the war, Israeli forces had gone further deep south into the Sinai Peninsula and captured the port of Sharm el-Sheikh, thereby opening the sea route through the Gulf of Aqaba and the Strait of Tiran, which had previously been blockaded by Egypt. Israeli victory over Egypt was complete. Interestingly though, Egyptian radio, the Voice of Arabs, was broadcasting a total fantasy. By the evening of the day 1 of the war, it broadcast that a major chunk of Israeli fighters had been downed and Egyptian forces had broken into Israel. And this false message of victory would lure King Hussein of Jordan into the conflict with disastrous consequences. When Israel began its attack against Egypt on the morning of June the 5th, about 3.5 hours into the attack, around 10:30 a.m., Israel sent a message to King Hussein of Jordan in which Israel stated its intent very clearly: you don't open fire, we don't open fire. Let's just let this thing blow over. It's none of our business to fight you. It's between us and Egypt. But starting 10 a.m., Jordan had already started shelling the outskirts of Tel Aviv and attacking some of Israeli coastal cities. Though Israel didn't consider Jordan really a threat, but at the narrowest point, the distance between West Bank and Israel's western border was just 9 miles. So if Jordan wanted, it could attack Israel and cut the country in half. Now it's important to remember that before the start of the war, one city in that region was divided between two states. The city was Jerusalem, with West Jerusalem being part of Israel, whereas East Jerusalem was in the West Bank area under Jordan. And at 11:15 a.m., Jordanian guns in East Jerusalem opened fire on West Jerusalem, causing extensive damage and killing 20 people. But at that time, Israel downplayed this mainly for two reasons. One was that its planes were still busy carrying out their missions over Egypt. And secondly, they felt that it was possible that King Hussein was just showing off to please Nasser and the attacks would end soon. However, as the day progressed, Israelis noticed that Jordanian radio seemed to be announcing the intentions of the Jordanian army in advance. For example, it announced that the Jordanian army had taken control of the government house ridge at the southern entrance of West Jerusalem at 10:30 in the morning, whereas the actual attack took place at 1:30 in the afternoon. And later, the Israelis realized that Jordan was indeed carrying out attacks on Israeli territory because of the overly positive and incorrect information broadcast by the Egyptians over radio and passed on to their allies. So Israel acted immediately and forces were sent to retake the government ridge, and a fierce battle ensued between the Jordanians and the Israelis near Mount Scopus. 2 days later, on the morning of June 7, Israeli forces had entered the West Bank to silence the artillery, and from there to take most of West Bank. And in the meantime, in Jerusalem, Israeli paratroopers had effectively encircled the city. And at that point, the Israeli government was presented with a fateful question. Should the Israeli forces enter the old city of Jerusalem with its holiest Jewish sites, including the Western Wall, or should they stay out? The Israelis debated this question for more than 24 hours, mainly because they were concerned about losing support of the Christian world if they entered the old city of Jerusalem, which also included the Christian holy sites. At the end of the deliberation, Israeli Prime Minister Eshkol sent a letter to King Hussein through the British embassy. In that letter, he made the king an offer. If you, your majesty, expel the Egyptian commanders of your army, if you regain control of your armed forces, if you accept a ceasefire unconditionally, if you begin the process of peace talks with us, we will not take the old city of Jerusalem. In the context of the times, this was a very extraordinary offer. The letter went out at 8:30 in the morning, and 2 hours passed, and there was no answer. So at 11:30 in the morning, Israeli paratroopers broke through the Lion's Gate into the old city. 2 more hours passed until the Israeli paratroopers, charged with the operation, reported in the words that continue to reverberate through Israel and the Middle East. Har Habayit Beyadenu, meaning the Temple Mount is in our hands. So over the course of 3 days, Israel had neutralized Egypt in the south and Jordan to the east. Towards the end of day 4 of the war, Egypt accepted a UN-imposed ceasefire, and on the early morning of day 5, Egyptian President Nasser finally admitted defeat and tendered his resignation, though retracting after Egyptians took to the streets to get him to stay in power. Now at this point, with Egypt having accepted the ceasefire, Israel too could have followed suit. But the artillery attack from atop the Golan Heights in Syria was proving to be a nuisance. So on June the 9th, day 5 of the war, Israel decided to launch an offensive against the Syrian positions in Golan Heights. On the morning of June 9, Israeli Air Force began an intensive 3-hour bombing of Syrian positions in the Golan, and before noon, Israeli forces had crossed the armistice line into Syrian territory. From here on, fierce battles ensued, and after fighting for more than 7 hours with heavy casualties, the Israeli forces were finally able to make a breach in the Syrian front lines. At 8:45 a.m. on June 10th, day 6 of the war, Damascus radio interestingly announced the fall of Quneitra, which is on the eastern end of Golan Heights. At that point, the Israelis were at least about 10 kilometers from the town. Syria was hoping of Soviet intervention by suggesting an Israeli advance towards the capital, Damascus. But it backfired. Hearing that the town had fallen, Syrian defenders throughout the Golan feared that they would soon be cut off, and they panicked and left their positions. By nightfall, all Syrian resistance on the Golan Heights had collapsed. And with that, the 6-day war came to an end. At the end of the 6 days, the entire geopolitical equation in the Middle East had changed. In less than a week, the young nation of Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. There was a surge of national pride within Israel since it had almost tripled its size as a result of the conflict. Egypt's President Nasser could not get over the shock of this defeat and died of a heart attack in 1970. Egyptian Field Marshal Amir died in mysterious circumstances, with his family claiming that he was poisoned. The big impact of the war, though, was that it made Israel into an occupier. And after 1967, it also helped kickstart the Palestinian national movement, which had so far been a puppet of the Egyptian President Nasser. The Fatah faction, led by Yasser Arafat, came to the fore, and slowly Yasser Arafat became an international figure as the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Israel had hoped to exchange some of the territories annexed after the war in exchange for peace But the Arab leaders met in Khartoum, Sudan in August of 1967 and signed a resolution that promised no peace, no recognition, and no negotiation with Israel. However, a big achievement after this war was the 1979 Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty under the leadership of US President Jimmy Carter, which led to Israel returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in 1982. And in return, Egypt recognized Israel as a legitimate sovereign state. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat won the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize for this accord. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. What was the last country to abolish slavery? In 1981, Mauritania became the last country in the world to abolish slavery. So the answer is A, Mauritania. Question for the current episode. Which site did a team of archaeologists rush to within weeks of its capture after the Six-Day War to collect some historical evidence? Was it A, the Western Wall in East Jerusalem? B, a church in Gaza? C, Herod's tomb near Jerusalem? Or D, Qumran in the West Bank? Once again, after the Six-Day War, which site became of intense interest to a team of archaeologists for the purpose of collection of some historical evidence? Was it A, the Western Wall in East Jerusalem? B, a church in Gaza? C, Herod's tomb near Jerusalem? Or D, Qumran in the West Bank? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we take a look at some of the big environmental disasters in modern times, their origins and their impact. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.